Great to see you all. My name is Jason Alari. I'm the Executive Director of the Historical Society. Thanks for coming out. Just have a couple announcements to make, and then we can get started. And there's some room here, right here in the front, if you'd like to be up close and personal. Mark your calendars, July 11th, History Shaken and Stirred at Covalent Spirits. This is a fun event. If you have any questions about it, Laura Bankert, our Outreach and Events Director, can tell you all about that event at Covalent, July 11th. Our next BLT, we're going to have Jonathan Herman here talking about 50 years of historic preservation, and that should be a great talk. We want to acknowledge our sponsors. Kevin, can you wave your hand? Axe Fairhaven, thank you for sponsoring today's event. And Ed and Meg Herring, are you in the room? Meg, are you here? But thank you for your sponsorship. John Laycock has a deep interest in studying family genealogy and local history. He is a board member of the Westminster chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution. Through the chapter's long-standing efforts, a Maryland roadside historic marker was placed in Bruceville in May, commemorating the Revolutionary War encampment of General Wayne and his troops, who helped force the British to Yorktown. And thank you to Judge Joe Getty for bringing the Northern News from Hampstead, Manchester, and Lyndeborough. There is an article here written by Judge Getty about the marker and the dedication. We have copies at the front, or maybe Laura brought them in, and by the coffee. So take a copy, and again, thank you for bringing this. John lives in Sykesville with his wife, 3 children, 4 cats, and 1 dog. Are they all the same? The dog's gone. So you're getting more cats then?
No.
Okay.
If anyone wants one, we've got a diabetic cat and another one with a thyroid issue. You're welcome to them.
All right. See John about the cats. He grew up in Chicago, remains a Cubs fan. Although we were chatting before the talk, he's leaning into the Orioles now, so more than ever. But anyway, without any more delay, can we welcome John to the podium? Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Turn this guy on. We'll get this set up. So I promise I'm not a prop comic, but I like to have some notes just to kind of keep me sorted. So good morning, or good afternoon, everybody. Really glad that you could be here today. My name is John Laycock. I'm a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, the Westminster chapter. I'm also a member of the Historical Society, and I'm here today to give a talk called Patriots in Carroll County, Norman Bruce. Now, Norman was really an accidental discovery for me. Some of you may remember my talk last year. We talked about Wayne's March coming down through Carroll County in the run-up to the Battle of Yorktown. Wayne and his troops left York, Pennsylvania on May 26, 1781, and they will encamp. They'll come down through Littlestown, and they will encamp in Bruceville, just south of Taneytown. And during the research for that, I discovered Norman Bruce. And as I said, he was an accidental discovery because we were really focused on the encampment. We were really excited about that. We talked about doing a historical marker. And I started reading about Norman and really got fascinated. I really went down a rabbit hole, which is why I'm here today to kind of pull some of that stuff out of the rabbit hole and show you guys and share that with you. One thing I would like to do is, I realize not everyone may be able to stand or to easily stand, but if everybody could just stand up for just a moment, and just indulge me here. And again, if it's hard for you to stand, it's okay to stay seated. If you are related to Norman Bruce, or you live in the house that Norman Bruce built, please stay standing, and everybody else can sit down. Yes, I planted the audience. Okay. So can we have a nice round of applause? We have Suzanne Falk. We have Barbara Crabster-Pragan, and we have Susanna Gardner-Key-Neal here today. Thank you. There should be some more family members coming. So, all right. Let's get started. So this is our agenda today. We have, who was Norman Bruce? And this is really, like I said, this is where I started going down the rabbit hole, and I started learning more and more about him. So he was a Scottish immigrant. He was a very prolific landowner. He'll own over 14,000 acres of land in Maryland, and I believe some in West Virginia as well. He will found the town of Bruceville. He's also a Revolutionary War patriot. He'll serve in the Maryland militia as an officer. And he holds a number of public offices. He's a public servant. Okay. So we're going to kind of go through and talk a little bit about that. I like the shield there as well, the family crest, in the Latin for "we have been." I thought that was a nice picture to kind of put in there. Now Norman, as I mentioned, was a Scottish immigrant. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, to Charles Bruce and Helen Cleland in 1733. We've got a really nice, I know it's hard to read, but that is his baptismal record. It shows that he was born in Scotland to Charles and Helen in 1733. Charles, through the various documents, is listed as a glazier, also as a mason. Barbara's actually done a lot more work on the Scotland side of things than I have. There is some evidence to suggest that the Bruce family may be related to Robert the Bruce, the Scottish king. He died without heirs, so they would be cousins, or he would be an uncle to them. That's not really nailed down. I'm really hoping that Barbara can pull that together for us, because it'd be really fascinating. Not to put any pressure on you. But still, it's kind of a neat tie, and if that's an actual relationship, that'll be really, really interesting to find out. So the talk today, we're really going to focus on a couple of families. And, we're going to talk about Norman's role, and he's kind of the starting point of all of this. But we're going to pull in some, prominent local Maryland families that are really significant from a historical perspective. But we're going to start with the Bruces. So Norman's going to arrive in America and settle in St. Mary's County sometime around 1757. Now Norman, as we will see, is really astute at building relationships. He's going to marry well. He's going to marry into the Key family. And we'll see that he has some ties as well to the Scott families. His brother will come afterwards. Around 1766, he will come, and he's going to be appointed with 3 other gentlemen, and they're going to be the Maryland General Assembly will actually appoint them as a commission to lay out the town of Cumberland in western Maryland. And later on in 1834, Andrew's son, Andrew Bruce Jr., will be authorized along with William Ridgely to lay out the town of Frostburg. Okay, so we can already see, the Bruces are, very prominent in Maryland history. Norman's sister, Selkirk, and her husband will arrive much later, around 1790 or so, and they would settle near Bruceville. They'll be buried in the family cemetery there. Selkirk's gravestone is lost at this point. It was a fairly prominent family cemetery that was there, but by the 1880s, there's only 5 markers that are still known to be existing there. There's, I think, 3 now that we know of. So now the Key family, and I've had to really watch my words because I want to say this is a Key relationship, and that's a really bad pun. I'm not going to do that. But the Keys were a very prestigious family in Maryland history, very wealthy, very prominent landowners. Philip Key was the first member of the first of the Maryland line. He was born in London. He will come to St. Mary's County in 1720, and he will set up at Bushwood Lodge. Bushwood Lodge, that's a picture of it. That house is still in existence today. I kind of skipped past this on the previous slide. That's a picture of Myrtle Hill. Again, that house is still there, as we know, from Suzanne being there. There's a couple of these old houses. I'm just amazed. We're coming on 250 plus years and they're still around. So the Key family was very prominent, very wealthy. Philip was a lawyer. He will hold a number of key offices. He will be the High Sheriff, presiding justice, and shortly before his death, he's going to be appointed to the very prestigious Council of Maryland in 1763. His sons would all hold public office, and he would have one daughter, and her name is Susanna Gardner Key. One of the things that, as you start studying these family names and their connections, you'll see that these families are very dedicated to carrying the names down through the generations. You know, as I mentioned, Susanna Gardner Key, her namesake is sitting over here. It's Susanna Gardner Key Neal. All right, it's really impressive. And as you go through the family trees, you'll see that just jumping out. You're going to see some variation of Bruce, Key, Scott, Boyle. It's pretty remarkable. Now, Norman is going to marry, like I said, he marries very well. He marries into the Key family. He will marry Susanna Gardner Key. She's a great aunt to Francis Scott Key, aunt to Francis's father, John Ross Key. Norman will, shortly after he gets married, he will become sheriff of St. Mary's County. I'm going to guess father-in-law probably had a little something to do with that. But that will be the first public office that we know about that Bruce will hold. And the last family I'm going to really go into some detail on is the Scotts. Upton Scott was a wealthy doctor in the Annapolis area. He's the mayor of Annapolis from 1767 to 1768. And he will marry Elizabeth Ross. Her father, John Ross, was another very prominent landowner, owned thousands of acres of land. And we can see that John Ross Key has been named after him, so you start to see those naming conventions kind of getting passed down. Elizabeth's sister Anne would marry Susanna Gardner Key's brother Francis, and they would have John Ross Key and grandfather Francis Scott Key. This is actually a picture of Upton Scott's house in Annapolis. Again, another house that's still in existence today. Now, John Ross Key will eventually settle at Terra Rubra. Francis Scott will be born there. And Terra Rubra is across the street from Bruceville. So again, these families are very close and really tied in together and know each other. Now, Bruceville gets founded by Norman in the 1760s. He's going to build his home, Myrtle Hill, there. And he originally doesn't own the land where Bruceville resides. That land was actually owned by his nephew, John Ross Key. So they had to go through and do some horse trading. They traded some properties. Bruce wanted to set up there, and he was very, very shrewd in choosing the site where Bruceville would be. You have a lot of things going for it. He's going to set up a farm there. He's got the water from Big Pipe Creek. He's right off the Monocacy Road. Okay, the Monocacy Road we know today is Francis Scott Key Highway. When we stop and think about some of these old roads or these roads that we drive today, a lot of them were based on old colonial roads, which were based on old Native American trails. And so, these pathways become things that we don't even think about today. And the Monocacy Road's a great example of that. Bruce was very shrewd, and he wanted that piece of property there for all of those reasons. He's got transportation coming through there. He's got water. He can set up a grist mill. He's going to set up a village. And it was a very key location for him. Now, he will set up the grist mill, call it Bruce's Mill. That mill will later be run by the Mering family after Bruce passes away. It'll burn down in the 1860s. Actually, one question I have, and Judge, you might know this, or Suzanne, you might know. Do we know where the millstone is from the mill? No? Okay. I was hoping it might still be on the property somewhere, because that's a big rock. You're not going to move that. Okay. And so Barbara was kind enough to share a picture with me. We can see this is a Christmas card from 1974. The Detweiler family sent this out. The Detweilers will own Myrtle Hill for most of the 1900s. So pretty neat. In fact, when I met with Rose and her family were looking through some of the old pictures. They have the same Christmas card. So it was kind of neat to see both of those there together like that. All right. Now, as I mentioned, Norman was really good at developing relationships. And in January of 1775, he's going to get his friend Thomas Johnson. Thomas is a fairly prominent politician, very well known in local circles, Frederick citizen. He serves in the First Continental Congress. He famously will nominate George Washington to lead the Continental Army in June of 1775. He will also become Maryland's first governor. So Bruce was friends with him, so he gets him to write a letter of introduction to George Washington. And so in January, Norman goes down and pays a visit to George, and Washington will write about this in his diary. He'll say, January 30th, ride into the neck to see the sick people, came home by muddy hole, a Mr. Bruce dined here. Okay? So Bruce was going there to try to do business with Washington. Obviously very wealthy, well-known, respected. Johnson in his letter wrote, his drift is to persuade people in general to manufacture coarse linens in earnest, to show that hemp is the proper material for us to rely on, much in preference of flax. He wishes for your encouragement of a work so well intended. So Bruce goes and has dinner with Washington. I mean, how many of us get to say that, right? And so he will go, and we'll find later in May in one of Washington's ledgers, he will actually buy some hemp seed from Bruce. Okay, so pretty cool. Now, the drumbeats of war are starting to kind of go on in the colonies at this time, right? Actually, I'll point out, on Thursday, Frederick County will be reading the Frederick Resolves. And this is one of the initial things. This is the 250th anniversary of the Frederick Resolves. And they're basically showing, the citizens of Frederick County were showing support for the folks up in Boston that were laid siege by the British. Okay? You're going to see over the next decade, you're going to start to see a lot of these types of 250th anniversary of this. The signing of the Declaration of Independence, Battle of Yorktown. You're going to start to see those. So this is one that's coming up here just in a couple of days. And they'll be doing a commemoration over at the Frederick County Courthouse. Now, also during this time, you're going to find that the colonies are starting to set up committees of observation, committees of safety. And these are really kind of the first attempts at creating a government from nothing, right? They've been a colony of the British for their entire existence. And so now, because they're unhappy and the British are really trying to exert control over them, they're starting to see these committees being stood up. It's a sign that the British authority is really weakening. Frederick County will set up a committee of observation in 1775. And as part of that, they're going to start to establish a militia. Now, this is in addition to the Continental Army that's headed up by Washington. And Norman, along with these other gentlemen that you see up on this slide, they will actually establish several companies in the Frederick Battalion. Now, the Committee of Observation is really a local Frederick County government, if you will. Maryland will have the Council of Safety, and we'll have the Continental Congress, and you start to see these groups don't always talk to each other well, right? There's a lot of local politics that's not understood at the state or at the federal level, and there's a lot of unreasonable expectations. And so you see things that don't quite fit together really well. Creating a government is hard. It's not something that just organically happens. We will see later when they go to write the Constitution, it's hard. Okay? And this is no exception. We're just setting up a militia at this point. And so Norman will be named a captain in the Frederick 3rd Battalion. And just to give you a bit of a sense of the size and scope, a battalion will usually have about 10 companies, and it will be headed up by a colonel or a lieutenant colonel. The companies themselves will be set up and led by a captain. They'll have about 60 to 100 men. And the captains will usually be responsible for going out and recruiting. So they'll go out to their neighborhoods and their neighbors and say, hey, come on, grab your gun, let's go, put this militia together. Now, at the same time that Norman is proposed as a captain, Frederick County, the Committee of Operations is going to propose that Norman be the colonel of the battalion. And for reasons that really aren't clear, the Maryland Council of Safety is going to nominate and put in place a gentleman named Jacob Good. Now, Jacob was a fairly wealthy businessman in the area. I'm not quite sure what the circumstances were there, you know, why he was put over for that position. I mean, Bruce had the Key and the Scott family. He was a successful businessman as well. But we'll see that Good later on in early part of 1776 will go and join the flying camps with the Continental Army. Okay, maybe he was looking for, maybe he didn't necessarily want to be in the militia, or maybe he was getting some pressure, you know, from the guys at home. I don't quite know, but it is an interesting distinction to make. And we'll see Norman will actually become colonel of the battalion later in October. I mentioned that, forming that government is hard, right? And we can start to see right now in October, Norman is put in place as the colonel of the now called 35th Battalion. Maryland will go through and rename all the battalions, change its name from the 3rd Battalion to the 35th Battalion, and Norman is put in as the colonel. We'll also see some of the names as his command staff, or some of the other captains that were on the previous slide. And he will also be serving under Brigadier General Thomas Johnson. So we start to see these names coming around and these connections that are happening here. Now we get to December of 1776, and Washington is under a lot of pressure. He's had some very disastrous defeats. He's had to retreat from New York. Congress is starting to doubt his leadership abilities. They've lost some very significant battles. And Washington is on a furious letter-writing campaign through the fall of 1776 and into the end of the year. He knows he has a looming recruitment crisis coming. A number of his men are due to be finish their terms of enlistment in January and February. And he still needs money, he needs supplies. They're in a really bad shape at this point. So he's been writing to Continental Congress, Maryland Council of Safety, all the different committees of observation and safety, begging for men and supplies. And on December 9th, Congress is going to request that the Maryland militia come up to Philadelphia and then on to New Jersey to help reinforce Washington. There will also be several other letters kind of going around. Copy of this letter went to Johnson and the Maryland folks. Maryland will send a letter to Johnson. And this is basically like everybody forwarding an email today, right? And so what we're going to see is that Johnson will start replying back, and there's all these letters. He's going to start forming up his army and getting the militia together through the month of December. One of the things that I found really interesting is part of the enlistment guaranteed these men shoes. And you think about that, right? I mean, how many shoes do you have in your closet now? And a lot of these folks probably only have one pair of shoes. They probably weren't that great. They were probably patched up and just made do with what they had. A lot of these folks are farmers and just living, very much off the land. Now, Johnson is very concerned about this. There are several letters where he's saying, okay, where do I get the shoes? Where do I pick them up? Are you going to send them to me in Frederick? Am I going to pick them up in Philadelphia? How's this going to work? Being a good leader, he's trying to take care of his men. Now, we'll also see at the end of December, and the timing of this to me is rather curious. We're going to see John Ross Key is named a captain in Bruce's battalion. So he's bringing in his nephew. Now, I said the timing is curious to me. It's very last minute. They're going to be getting on the road January 1st and start marching up to Philadelphia and into New Jersey. And so Key is named as the captain, and he has definitely a very significant military background. He will be part of Thomas Price's rifle company that goes up in 1775 to support Washington. They're one of the first troops that go up to Boston to help support Washington up there. We'll see his involvement here in early 1777. I believe we do have some records of him, and don't quote me on this, but I believe he was also at the Battle of Germantown. And at the very end of the war, we see him kind of at the beginning with the Siege of Boston, and in 1781, he will be part of a cavalry unit that's down in Virginia underneath General Lafayette. So he's kind of bookending the war here, from beginning to end. And he will go on to other things militarily later in his career. He will become a general. So John Ross Key is another, there's a lot of interesting people that, I will go through and talk about today. But I wouldn't be surprised if I'm back here talking to you guys about John Ross Key at some point. Now, as I mentioned, this period of time for Washington is really difficult. Okay, the morale is down with his men, Congress is doubting him, and he's in a spot. He needs a win, he needs a hit, he needs it now. And so while most of us are probably used to things kind of slowing down at Christmas time, getting together with loved ones and family and friends, Washington's, trying to figure out what he's going to do with the British. And there's this period called the 10 Crucial Days. Now remember, they have had a number of defeats. They've left New York. It was only by the actions of the Maryland 400, they were the rear guard that defended the Continental Army at the retreating from New York. Washington famously will say, what brave men are these that I'm going to lose today, talking about the Maryland 400. If you've never read about them, there's a couple of really good books. There's one called Washington's Immortals, and the Maryland State Archive actually has a website that talks about finding the Maryland 400. They've got a bunch of biographies up there. Pretty interesting. So that kind of brings us to where Washington is. And I really wanted to kind of stress they're in a bad way at this point. Now, on December 25th and into the morning of December 26th, we all know the story. Washington crosses the Delaware River, surprises the Hessians, and wins a very significant battle. Okay, the famous painting here of him boldly going across the Delaware. Now they actually had 2 detachments that weren't able to cross the river because of how bad the weather was. It was icy and cold. So he didn't have his full army with him. He had about 2,400 men. However, the Hessians, and there's stories that have pretty much been kind of debunked. There's stories that the Hessians were celebrating Christmas and they were drunk and hungover. Probably not true. But the Hessians did underestimate the American army. And they didn't have any sentries posted. They weren't doing patrols. And so when Washington crossed over and attacked, they were surprised. They weren't expecting it. Okay? So it was a very bold action. It was the kind of bold action that Washington needed. So they were able to surprise the Hessians. They'll capture 1,000 men, and they will bring them back over the Delaware River. The story is that nobody died. And if you think about the conditions, the weather, bringing back 1,000 prisoners, that is a very audacious undertaking. And it shows maybe some of the desperation that Washington was feeling at the time as well. Now, a couple days later, Washington and his army will cross over the Delaware again, and they will start moving towards Trenton. And they will actually have a second battle there. Now, in the lead up to that battle, General Cornwallis in the British Army was coming down. I think he had roughly about 5,000 men. He's going to put a garrison in Princeton of about 1,400 men. And then he's going to start heading down to Trenton. Washington will have sharpshooters in the trees that will basically slow down Cornwallis's march into Trenton. And they're going to arrive just before dark. There will be a brief battle, firefight. This is what we call the Battle of Assunpink Creek. I may not have that pronunciation right, I apologize. It's also called the Battle of Trenton II. This takes place on January 2nd. And because it's getting dark, Cornwallis decides to retreat and stop for the night, and he's intending to resume the fight into the morning. Now Washington realizes that they're outnumbered. And so he gets his men together, has a council of war, and they devise a plan. There's a little-known Quaker Road. And so he takes the bulk of his army. He leaves about 500 men on the battlefield, or at the camp there in Trenton. and he will take the bulk of his army and go down that little Quaker road towards Princeton under the cover of night. Meanwhile, he's got those 500 men. He's got artillery that's periodically firing shells into the British Army, just mainly to let them know they're there, kind of distract them a little bit. And then he'll have his 500 men with shovels and pickaxes making a lot of noise, keeping the fires going through the night to make it look like the army digging in and getting ready for a big battle the next day. And then finally, just before dawn, those guys will go and follow Washington on their way to Princeton. You can imagine Cornwallis's surprise when they go to attack the next morning and there's nobody there. Brilliant military move by Washington in that regard. They will go up to Princeton. They'll fight a battle up there and they'll win a very significant victory there as well. So within the span of 10 days, Washington changes the perceptions of his leadership in the Continental Army. Okay. Cornwallis, at this point, because it's getting to be cold and winter, he will withdraw into the northern part of New Jersey, and everybody's going to set up their winter headquarters. Now, during all of this time, Washington still knows he's going to be losing a bunch of men over the month of January and February. So he's been recruiting and calling out to the militias, not only Maryland, but Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, asking for reinforcements to help him get through that enlistment period so he can rebuild his army. Now, the period of time from January through March of 1777, it's called the Forage War. Now remember, Washington and his troops fled from New York. The British Army followed them. They're going through the countryside of New Jersey and New York. They're plundering and stealing anything they can find. They don't have a lot of supplies. Washington comes through, and then the British come through. They're plundering and stealing, okay? So now we have this situation where it's wintertime. There's not a lot of supplies. And this is called the Forage War because these guys are literally going out through the countryside trying to find any food or supplies they can to survive. There will be a number of skirmishes that happen through this time. You'll see probably Elizabethtown and Drake's Farm are two of the more well-known skirmishes. But I want to talk to you about one that takes place in Whippletown, New Jersey. Lowly Private Zoll. Okay. Private Zoll is a young man, farmer from Frederick County. He's going to enlist in the Maryland militia, and he's going to serve under John Ross Key. And he's going to give us a first-hand account of his service, from January through April of 1777. And we know about this because in 1832, Congress is going to pass what's called the Pension Act. This was like the last, it's just 60 years after the war, almost. And this is like the last pensions that they were going to allocate out for the Revolutionary War veterans. There have been a number of land grants and other things like that through the years, but this is really intended to be the last one. Most of these guys have passed on at this point. And Jacob Zoll is going to apply for a pension. Now, this pension offers a full pension if you serve more than 2 years. If you serve 6 months to 2 years, you would get a partial pension. Unfortunately, Jacob Zoll served for 4 months. So his application was rejected. However, he gives us an incredible insight into what he was doing through January and through April of 1777. And I'm going to read this to you, and it's going to be a little bit of a long read, but I think it's a rather extraordinary account of his service and what he was doing. And I'll start. So from the great length of time, I can only recollect the name of General Putnam of the Continental Establishment, and the regiment in which I served, I think to the best of my recollection, was called the 4th Regiment of Maryland Militia, and commanded by Colonel Norman Bruce and Major James Shields, and was acquainted with General Smallwood, commander of the Maryland line of regular troops, and also with Captain William Wilson, Captain William Shields, Captain Philip Matthews, and Captain John Ross Key, who commanded my own company, and also with Lieutenants Hockey Smith and Thomas and Joseph Wilson. The general circumstances of my service were these: there being a general movement amongst the people of my neighborhood to fight for their liberties. I volunteered for 3 months in a company with the majority of my neighbors who were able to bear arms, in company of the Maryland Militia, commanded by John Ross Key at Taneytown in Frederick County, Maryland. On the first day of January of the year AD 1776, remember, he's recalling this 60 years on. He means 1777, but you'll see he says 1776 here. I'm going to give him a little break on that one. From which our whole regiment marched through the snow about knee-deep. This is why those shoes were so important. Okay, these guys are going through knee-deep snow to march from Taneytown up to Philadelphia, New Jersey. They marched through the snow about knee-deep via McAllisterstown, Little York. They're basically going up the Monocacy Road, by the way, okay? And Lancaster to Philadelphia, where we arrived sometime about the middle of the month of January AD 1776, and stayed there 8 days. Thence we were marched to Morristown, this is where Washington has its headquarters, via Bastogne Ridge, and then to the Delaware River, which we passed on the ice about 40 miles up said river from Philadelphia. We then marched into the state of New Jersey near Quibbletown, where from the severity of the cold and the want of provisions, our regiment was scattered out in parcels of 10 and 20 amongst the neighboring farmers. Whilst in this situation, the British approached and attacked some of our men near Trenton. And they retreated back on us near where the regiment to which I belonged, having been called together, and a regiment under General Putnam had a general battle with the said party of British, which battle was closely fought for about 1/2 of an hour, when the British made a retreat, leaving the field of battle in our possession, leaving none of our men either killed or wounded. About 4 weeks after this battle took place, a regiment marched back to Philadelphia by the same road that we had come. This battle took place sometime in the month of February AD 1776, I think it was February 8th, after which we were discharged to Philadelphia, thence I returned home. I know he didn't get the pension, but I think he should have. This is a really extraordinary first-hand account. I mean, the guy walked through knee-deep snow from Taneytown up to New Jersey, okay? He had the battle, and now, militarily speaking, it's probably more of a skirmish, not a full-fledged battle, but I can imagine him back home afterwards sitting in the bar telling his buddies about this big battle he fought back in the war. And, you know, I mean, and we didn't lose a guy. Nobody got wounded. You know, go USA, right? But, you know, being able to have this, you know, this was 60 years afterwards he's talking about this. It's extraordinary, and it gives us a really good insight into what Norman Bruce and his men were doing. Okay. It was not typical for the militias to be going up to New Jersey like this. You know, think about the militia. They're really more like what we would consider maybe the National Guard. You know, so they're going to be kind of protecting the homeland, if you will. So the fact that they're up in New Jersey shows, one, how desperate Washington was, but two, just how important it was for them to be there in the first place. Okay, so typically, the kind of experience we expect the militia to have, you know, will be some things like this. This is some more accounts of the Maryland militia. I'm still sorting through some of this. We know that there are some Maryland militia units at the rather disastrous defeat at the Battle of Paoli. They'll also be at the Battle of Germantown. The militia unit that were at Germantown, actually, Washington had a very complex battle plan set up, and the militia unit were supposed to come around through and kind of come back and come around onto the other side of the British. There was a dense fog that morning, and they got lost. They were very heavily criticized for that, but I mean, the weather conditions, yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily fair. But more typical of what we would expect the militia is the guard duty type of thing. General Burgoyne was a British general. He lost the Battle of Saratoga, and at the time they had about 6,000 men there up in Saratoga, and so they entered into a convention, terms of surrender. Burgoyne will actually get fairly generous terms of surrender at the time. And they will be marched down to Massachusetts where they're going to be housed. And those roughly 6,000 men, over time, there will be guys that escape and leave. Some will be traded for other prisoners. But there's a large portion of those men that are going to be prisoners of war for the rest of the Revolutionary War. okay? And in 1778, they're going to be force marched from Massachusetts down to Charlottesville, Virginia. They're going to come through through Maryland on the Monocacy Road, okay? Again, this is important, right? This is a major thoroughfare. Now, as they come through, militia guys are asked to come out and help do pole guard duty. So we see letters, they're asking for about 500 men to come out and help make sure that these guys don't escape or anything. And in fact, in 1781, Benedict Arnold is going through the countryside, and later General Cornwallis will come in and take over the British troops in Virginia. They ransack Richmond. Thomas Jefferson and all the politicians are on the run. Jefferson will write Washington asking for help, which is why General Lafayette's sent down to Virginia. And there was a very real concern that Cornwallis was going to make a run for the convention prisoners and try to rescue them. So they're sent back up north. These guys are getting marched around the eastern seaboard here. So they're going to be sent up to Philadelphia, and some guys will stay, they'll be placed at Fort Frederick, and they'll start to split these guys up a little bit. But there's a lot of things kind of happening there in the background. We'll see in 1779, Bruce is going to be named the county lieutenant. This type of position, he's basically in charge of the county. So he's making sure the recruitments are taking place, that the guys have their supplies, he's taking the orders and sending out the troops as he sees fit to respond to different things. There's a number of times where the British will be coming up to Chesapeake Bay and they'll need to send guys out to kind of respond to that. 1779, they get a request for guard duty for 400 prisoners from Philadelphia down to Fort Frederick. I believe these are some of the Hessians that were captured by Washington during the Battle of Trenton. I'm not 100% on that though. But these are, this guard duty type of thing is what we typically expect for the state militias. Now I mentioned Anthony Wayne coming down through Maryland, again, the Monocacy Road. This is where everything really started for me. I started studying his march from York, Pennsylvania down into Virginia. We found out that they left York on May 26th, they go through Littlestown and they encamp at Bruceville, and we were very lucky to get a marker dedicated there. It just went up a couple weeks ago. If you get a chance, it's on Francis Scott Key Highway, just north of Bruceville Road on the southwest corner of the bridge going over Big Pipe Creek. Brand new sign, so very cool, very exciting. But what this points to is what I was talking to earlier of Bruceville being a very strategic location. You've got a hilltop there. You get up on top of that hill, you've got a great vantage point of the surrounding area. You've got Big Pipe Creek, you've got water, you've got a grist mill, you've got a farm. They also knew that they had Norman Bruce there. Now, I don't know if Norman was there when they encamped, but they knew they at least had a friendly place to stop for the night. So again, Bruceville is prominent. And we're going to see 80 years later, when General Meade's coming through Frederick County, or Carroll County at that time, he's going to headquarter at Taneytown, but he's going to have his troops spread out through the countryside. And he's going to create what's called the Pipe Creek Line. And this was actually a really brilliant defensive setup that he had. He knew that Lee was in the north. He didn't know where Lee was going to go. So he takes all of his troops and spreads them out in a line, and they basically are on all the major roads between Lee and the cities of Washington and Baltimore. So that if Lee starts making a run to one of those cities, he can have his troops converge in on that point. And so he's staging them as he goes. And we know that on June 29th, the 12th Corps, which was headed by Major General Henry Slocum, will encamp at Taneytown and Bruceville. And then later, the next day, the artillery reserves will encamp at Bruceville. Okay? So again, this points to the key strategic nature of Bruceville. You've got the water, you've got the high ground, you've got the major road, the thoroughfare. Okay? This defensive structure also allowed for, if Lee made a move, Meade can counter and bring in other troops to reinforce if they went down a particular road or direction. So again, points to the importance of Bruceville. Now, I talked a little bit about some of the public service that Bruce did. He was sheriff of St. Mary's County. He was also sheriff in Frederick County. In fact, there's a structure on the grounds at Myrtle Hill that's believed to be the first jail of Frederick County. You see he holds a couple of other offices here. In 1780, he's actually elected to the Maryland Lower House, and unfortunately, he did not attend, and he would resign that position for reasons unclear. Now, after the war, Bruce is still out there hustling, right? He's trying to, build his wealth, and he's got a lot of irons in the fire, if you will. So he and one of the fellow officers he served in the Maryland militia with, Charles Beatty, he was a colonel of one of the other battalions. They will be out surveying. They will be asked by the Maryland legislature to go and explore the Potomac River. And while they're out there exploring, they run into his old dinner companion, George Washington. And they exchange some pleasantries, and Washington urges him to keep exploring. Now, the whole purpose of these canals was really to get a waterway from the Great Lakes down through Virginia and Maryland and out to the Chesapeake ultimately. Washington actually had invested in and was the first president of the Potomac Company. And they would build 5 canals, but they didn't really get where they needed to. The C&O Canal Company would eventually buy the Potomac Company. And there was kind of the competition. Washington really wanted to have the canal be on the Virginia side of the Potomac. And of course, the Maryland folks wanted it on the Maryland side, and eventually C&O Canal is on the Maryland side. But this just kind of shows that he's out there. There's a letter that Bruce will write in 1784 to Washington proposing a venture. There's a copy of that letter up at the Minnesota Historical Society. I was able to get a copy of it, so it's really neat to kind of see Bruce's own handwriting. Pretty interesting stuff. Now, in 1811, Bruce will pass away in April, and his will be probated in May of 1811. And when you go through his will, you start to realize the extent of his holdings. He's got a lot of land. He's got a lot of money. He leaves it to his children and to a niece, Susanna Bruce. He will also have about 20 slaves that he will leave to his children as well. Okay, it's a sign of how much wealth he had. A lot of people, I just read a book recently, about the slave trade, and I didn't really appreciate how, the slaves were really viewed as chattel, and there was really a monetary value to these folks. And it's really, they had trading auctions up in the Inner Harbor. Okay, so the idea of, you can count the number of slaves and start to get a feel for how wealthy the families might have been. But the story's not going to end here, okay? So we're going to see, through some of Norman's descendants, and also his money, they're going to persist and continue into the 21st century, okay? And you'll see what I mean in a moment here when I talk about one of his sons. This is part of the deck that I kind of call the name-dropping part of the deck here. We're going to start to see some of the relatives of Norman Bruce and some of the impact that they've had in Carroll County and other places. So his oldest son, Upton Bruce, he will settle out in Western Maryland. He will serve in the Maryland House of Delegates, and probably most notably, he's the grandfather of Emily Price. Does anybody here know who Emily Price is? You might know her better by her married name, Emily Post. So Upton Bruce is the grandfather of Emily Price. Norman is the great-grandfather of Emily Post. Excuse me. So now Upton really kind of followed what I call Norman's Maryland side, or his Maryland personality. So when Norman gets to America, he speculates in land, gets involved in local politics. Upton really follows that kind of model of his father. But then there's the Scottish side of Norman. And Charles is really going to follow that Scottish side. He's going to be the adventurer. He's going to travel the world. In his younger days, he will depart for Scotland and study medicine. And like a lot of young men in that era seeking adventure, he's going to enroll as a ship surgeon in the East India Tea Company and make his way to India. And he's going to see the world. And we'll see when he passes away. It's crazy going through his will. But through all of this, he never marries. He doesn't have any children that we know of. When he gets to India, he's going to jump ship. And Barbara shared some documents with me last week. You know, they were actually calling for him. You know, and we're not quite sure. He must have worked out some sort of deal because he will run a newspaper in Calcutta for 26 years. Now, he will get news that his father had passed away, and he has a period of time where he's got to get back home to claim a rather large inheritance. And so he will return to America, and he will eventually settle in Staten Island, New York, where he passes away in 1826. Now, just like his father, you know, because he inherited, I think it was roughly $100,000 in 1800s money, whatever that works out to today, I don't know. But he's going to leave a lot of money to friends and family that he's met through the years. So when you go through his will, it is just a list of names from everywhere. He's also going to establish several legacies and charities. Most notably, they will create the Dr. Bruce Fund in Edinburgh, Scotland. This fund is there to help people that are poor, need some money, and so that money will actually, that fund is still active to today. Okay, there's still money in that account. Think about that. 200 years after the death of his father, almost 200 years after the death of Charles, Norman's money is still helping people. And by the way, there's a great article by Mamie Ashcraft about Charles. It's worth a read. You know, definitely check that out if you can. It's kind of paints a picture of Charles as well. Now, Norman's youngest child, his only daughter, Elizabeth Keepers, she stays in the area. So, you know, the Neils over here, those are her descendants. Okay. Now, she will marry John Scott. That's the nephew of Upton Scott that I talked about earlier, bringing that back full circle here a little bit. And they will build a house up on top of that hill from Myrtle Hill that is called Good Intent, and they'll build that in 1811. And their descendants are going to blaze a path through Carroll County history as well. The first one I'll talk about, he's not a direct descendant of Norman Bruce, but he marries John Scott and Elizabeth's daughter, Elizabeth Maynadier Bruce Scott. And she's obviously a granddaughter of Norman. But Colonel John Brooke Boyle is a prominent politician in early Carroll County history. Okay? He's all over the place. He was also very wealthy. He was the secretary and treasurer of the Western Maryland Railroad. And probably where most of us here know him from is he was a host to the Confederate Colonel Thomas Lafayette Rosser, and who had set up, they were going through, getting ready to come through Westminster. They actually stayed at his house for the night, and he invited them in, fed them dinner. 2 or 3 of Boyle's sons will actually serve in the Confederacy. And where most of us know Boyle from is the marker commemorating his house. It became known as Rosser's Choice down here in downtown Westminster. Now, Colonel Boyle's grandson is Norman Bruce Boyle. Jason, you're going to like this guy here. You have a tie to Norman Bruce. One of your predecessors, Norman Bruce Boyle, director of the Historical Society, is the great-great-grandson of Norman. So I should have had you stand up earlier, too. But Norman Bruce Boyle was a very successful banker here in Westminster, very well-to-do. He served in World War I. He was very involved in local civic organizations. When you go through his obituary, he must have been in 10 or 20 different civic groups. I don't know how he had time for all of that. One of the ones I found really interesting is he served as president and chief of the Westminster Fire Department. So that's pretty cool. I also found there was a Baltimore Sun posting from 1954. It was part of the Tawnytown Bicentennial. They actually were hosting tours at Bruceville and Myrtle Hill. So pretty interesting. And the last one I'll talk about here is Basil Long Crafter. Barbara, his daughter, is here today. Norman is actually Barbara's 7th grade uncle, I think it is. And yours? Yeah, okay, well, we're close. He was born here, just south of here in Tawnytown. He was a noted local historian. His files are at the Historical Society Library. Okay, so if you ever want to research those, I've been in there to look at them. He has a lot of information in there, a lot of good notes. Can be difficult to read. Rather than a history professor, he probably should have been a medical doctor, because his handwriting is just you can probably read it really well, but it's for the rest of us, yeah. So, he studied at Princeton and Harvard, taught at Gettysburg College. He actually knew the Neal family. He stood up in the wedding of Susanna. It's your grandparents, right? Your parents. So he stood up at her parents' wedding anniversary as a groomsman with his brother. Also, just to kind of tie this back to Littlestown as well, Vassal's great-great-great-grandfather married Susanna Klein. She's the daughter of Peter Klein, aka Little, the founder of Littlestown. Okay, so you start looking at all these names and start pulling these things together. It gets really interesting. And so that's really the bulk of my talk here today. I'm going to open up the floor for any questions or anything, but I wanted to say thank you to everybody for being here today. I really appreciate the time and the attention. And I also want to extend a very special thank you to Lynn and the Historical Society for having me back. I really appreciate it. And one last thing. As I'm taking questions, I'm going to flip over to one more slide, which will have a number of the sources that I used to help me prepare this talk. So feel free to come up and take a picture or write down what's up on there. There's some online resources as well. So I always like to share those out because I think they're interesting for folks to have. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jason. And if anybody has questions, Jason's got a microphone.
I couldn't find anything online. Does any image of Norman Bruce exist? Painting? Nothing?
I've been looking. I think all of us here have talked about that as well. We would love to see a painting or a picture or something.
There's one over here on this side. Let's see, hand go up. No.
I'm very new to this, but I do have a question. How did they bring those all from Scotland? It's not like he could just, have a cashier's check and spot that. So he gets here.
I'm sorry, can you start over again, please?
Yes, I want to know, how did Bruce get his wealth from Scotland to here? Because you couldn't carry a check back in those days.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that one.
Lynn, you have a question?
Forgive me if I missed this, John, but was religion, did religion play a part in his life? I mean, I know there was still a lot of Protestant, Catholic back and forth going on back in those days, and I wonder if that had anything to do with his role of resigning.
Yeah, there was. I don't remember which church it was. I know that there was, in one of Scharf's writings, he talks about Norman and a group of other men raising some money to build a church and I think a school as well. But I don't remember what denomination it was. I know a lot of the rest of the family is very Catholic, so they're buried in a lot of the Catholic cemeteries in the area.
Hi, I'm from Carroll County, and I was just curious, is there still an area called Bruceville, or is that been incorporated into another town now?
It's not officially known as Bruceville. When you look at a lot of the maps, it'll be listed as Keymar, more of a nod to the Key family, concatenation of Key in Maryland. But Bruceville is still, there's Bruceville Road, just comes off of Francis Scott Key Highway. And I don't know, do you ever get anything addressed to Bruceville, Suzanne? No, it's always Keymar? Okay.
Have you ever had an opportunity to go to Bruceville?
Yeah, I've gone through there. I'm going to get an opportunity to check out Myrtle here in the near future as well.
You can't get out, you have to turn around.
Yep.
I grew up in Keymar, so I was in Bruceville many times.
Okay, yeah, it's, I remember when I went back to take a look, there's like a trucking company right at the beginning of Bruceville had a lot of very scary signs about don't trespass, stay off the land, you know, that kind of thing. But yes, we did drive through and I've taken a look at it. I know, Mimi, you had gone there several years ago with some folks. Yeah.
A couple of us have been in Bruceville, and long ago, the woman who owned the Marion house, the Norman Bruce house, we went up to that cemetery where Selkirk died, I think it is, and some of them were buried. It overlooks Big Pipe Creek, and it was in terrible shape.
Yeah.
Some of the stones were even embedded in the trees at that point.
Yeah, I think it's up by that fertilizer shop, right? The Kemar Fertilizer, the cemetery?
No, it's basically not very far from where your sign was put up,
Okay.
John. Yeah, up on the
Okay. Yeah.
hill there.
No, it's definitely a place. I need to get there to check that out. I was talking with someone online, and she had mentioned that her son had taken the pictures and that it was up by that fertilizer shop, which is why I thought that was there. So that's interesting. I'll get with you after this to talk about that.
What is the current name for McAllister Town?
What?
McAllister Town.
I'm not sure.
It's not Hanover.
Yeah, I did a real quick.
Or is it?
Yeah, I did a real quick look for it, and I really couldn't figure out where it was. So some other folks here might know more than I would.
Richard McAllister found
Oh, okay. I mean, it's also mentioned in a Jefferson diary, that he had passed through Frederick and Town, and then Callister Town, and then over the Susquehanna and on towards Philadelphia. And
Yeah.
I just didn't know what the
It's
real.
been bugging me too. I don't know where it is.
Yeah, I hope I can comment on a couple of the questions. The question about religion, Norman and all of his siblings were baptized in the Church of Scotland, and those who stayed in Scotland and were married there were married in the Church of Scotland, which we know as Presbyterian. And when he came over, when he married Susanna Gardner Key, he got married in the Episcopal Church, and I'm pretty sure he stayed in that church afterwards. So I can't say anything about whether he was discriminated against or not, but I kind of doubt it. In terms of bringing wealth over, I'm not sure that he brought much wealth with him. In his father's will, his father made a statement about forgiving him the money that he used to buy cloth and clothing when he came to this country. And nothing else is mentioned. So my guess is his father got him suited up appropriately to do business and sent him on his way. We aren't sure exactly what Norman did when he first came to this country. The family had some relationship with a group called the Glasgow Tobacco Lords. These were merchants who did a lot of business with the sort of Virginia, Southern Maryland area, and they would ship over British goods and bring back tobacco and market it. So my father, I think, thought that that was a really good line of inquiry, and I know he has a folder or two on some of the tobacco lords. I don't know what it is. I haven't had a chance to look. But I'm not aware that he felt he proved anything with that relationship. But it's, you can envision him coming over perhaps as an agent for one of the tobacco dealers, and then in the process, meet somebody in the Key family, gets introduced to the daughter, and the rest is history.
Anyone else here?
Hi, I was born in Bruceville, and the first 10 years of my life was spent down there, and in the house on Burnell Hill, there was a family that lived there, an elderly
Yeah, I don't know on those, I've seen those houses as well, and there's a number of different structures that date to different periods of time, and I just, I'm not much on the architectural side. I studied engineering in college, so I didn't think about architecture, but no, I've been wondering about that as well, because it would be, I've always wondered about, like, Hurricane Agnes coming through and Pipe Creek, did it overflow, where some of those houses washed out. Those are all kind of things I've wondered about, just over the years. And frankly, I wonder if that was some of the reasons why some of the gravestones were lost, various storms through the years, as well as just neglect and not being taken care of.
And the mill that was down there, at the time, most of the men that lived in the area worked at that mill. And there was a canal that had machinery in there that would pump water. And it used to be a favorite place for
Yeah.
kids, and it was a dangerous place.
So there is a map from the Maring family that shows like the raceway for the mill and some of the other things on there. One interesting thing that I noticed on that map is that along the creek bed, there's an area that's marked as a quarry. And I'm assuming that's where they maybe got the millstone from. So I don't know, do you remember seeing anything like that along the creek side when you were playing as a kid or anything? No? Okay. I think it was on the north side of the creek bed, if I remember right.
Used to love the railroad bridge that went across the river. Played on that bridge.
Yeah. No, it's a neat little area, so it must have been a lot of fun as a kid.
Anyone else? Going once? Thank you, John, very much.
Thank you.
For your help.